43 years. That is the exact number economists whisper when they discuss how long it takes a nation to rebuild its economic identity after losing a major trade anchor. 43 years of pain, of uncertainty, and of crawling back from the very edge. And right now, Canada is standing on that edge, staring straight down into the abyss. But here is the specific part nobody in Washington expected. The man standing there isn't panicking. He's not scrambling. He's not begging. He's measuring the fall, calculating every single inch of it with cold, analytical precision. Because when Donald Trump moved, he didn't just impose tariffs. No, that is the surface level story the media keeps repeating. What he actually did was far more calculated, far more aggressive. He struck at the exact moment Canada was entering a federal election cycle. Think about that for a second. If you wanted to destabilize a country, to force it into a bad deal, when would you strike? When it's strong or when it's distracted, divided, and desperate for a quick political win? That was not an accident. That was a trap, carefully timed and perfectly placed. And almost every analyst across North America said the same thing. Canada would walk straight into it. They would rush to negotiate. They would panic. They would take whatever deal they could spin as a victory back home. That is what was supposed to happen. But it didn't. Mark Carney looked at that trap, studied it, and then did something that frankly shocked the entire modern diplomatic playbook. He slowed down, not because he was weak, not because he didn't have options, but because he understood something about Trump that most commentators still don't fully grasp. Trump doesn't just want to win, he needs one. Fast, loud, and visible. Something he can hold up before the next news cycle and say, look, we dominated. And the moment you understand that, really understand it, the entire balance of power flips. Because the one thing that strategy cannot tolerate is silence, delay, and waiting. So Canada said something simple, something quiet, and something incredibly dangerous. We'll wait. And that is where everything changed. Because while Washington kept checking the clock, Ottawa had already started rewriting the calendar. And what they were building behind the scenes is something most people still haven't even noticed. Now, here is where the story takes a turn most people completely missed. Because on the surface, waiting looks like weakness. It looks like hesitation. It looks like a country buying time because it has no better option. But what Carney understood, what his entire team understood, is that in this particular fight, time isn't neutral. Time is a weapon. You see, Trump's strategy is built around speed, fast pressure, fast escalation, and fast wins. The kind of wins that dominate headlines, flood the media cycle, and energize a political base that thrives on visible victories. That is not a flaw. It is how his system works. But every system has a vulnerability, and this one cannot function without momentum. So what happens when the other side refuses to move? What happens when, instead of reacting, instead of scrambling, and instead of rushing into negotiations, they just sit back and say, we're not in a hurry? Everything starts to break. Because every day without a deal is a day without a headline. Every week without progress is a crack in the narrative of dominance. And Carney knew that. He didn't just understand it. He built his entire response around it. This was not delay for the sake of delay. This was controlled resistance, a calculated slowdown designed to drain the urgency out of Washington's strategy. But here is the part that should really make you pause. Canada was not just waiting while the cameras were focused on public statements, polite diplomacy, and carefully worded press releases. Something else was happening underneath, quietly, systematically, and almost invisibly. Carney's team started moving pieces behind the scenes. Conversations that used to take months suddenly accelerated. Trade discussions that once felt routine became urgent. Doors that had been half open for years were now being pushed wide open. And not in Washington, but in Europe and across the Indo-Pacific. Let that sink in. While the United States thought it was applying pressure, Canada was building exits. Not dramatic exits, not loud headline-grabbing moves. No grand announcements. Just quiet, methodical construction. One agreement here, one supply chain adjustment there, one new partner at a time. The kind of changes that don't make breaking news, but change everything once they are complete. And here is the real twist. The one almost nobody in mainstream analysis is talking about. From Washington's perspective, Carney still looks cooperative, calm, and reasonable. No threats, no public escalation, and no dramatic counterattacks. Exactly the kind of counterpart you don't feel urgent about confronting. But that is the illusion, because the longer this calm continues, the more time Canada has to finish what it started. And by the time that shift becomes visible to everyone, it may already be too late to stop it. So ask yourself this: who is really in control of the timeline here? Because it is definitely not the side staring at the clock. Now we get to the number, the one that should make anyone in Washington sit up straight. 41%. That is how much of Canada's most strategically critical exports are now being actively repositioned toward non-American buyers. Energy, critical minerals, and advanced manufacturing, the very backbone of modern economic power. 41% already in motion. 18 months ago, that number was not even close to 10%. Let that sink in for a moment. This is not theory. This is not political messaging. This is real, measurable movement happening quietly, steadily, right under the surface. And the speed of it, that is what makes it so unsettling. Conversations with the European Union that used to crawl through years of bureaucracy suddenly started moving in weeks. Indo-Pacific partners, countries that once treated Canada as a secondary player, are now engaging like this is urgent, like this actually matters. Because it does. What we are watching is not a retreat. It is a pivot, a controlled, deliberate pivot executed under pressure. And that is what makes it so dangerous, because it is happening while the system is supposed to be locked in place. But here is where it gets even more precise, almost surgical. Carney is not blowing up the relationship with the United States. He is not slamming doors. He is not giving Trump the confrontation he could turn into a political weapon. Instead, he is running two strategies at the same time: one you can see and one you can't. The visible one, calm diplomacy, cooperative language, and a steady, almost frustratingly reasonable tone. No drama, no escalation, the kind of posture that makes it look like Canada is still fully engaged, still open, and still aligned. And then there is the second strategy, the one actually shaping the future. Behind closed doors, supply chains are being rerouted, dependencies are being reduced, new agreements are being drafted, negotiated, and in some cases quietly finalized. It is like watching a building being dismantled from the inside while the exterior looks completely untouched. And here is the psychological brilliance of it. Trump's team is looking at Carney and seeing exactly what they expect to see: a cooperative partner who is not pushing back aggressively, who is not trying to embarrass the United States on the global stage, and who is not forcing a dramatic escalation. And because of that, there is no immediate trigger to react harder, no urgency spike, and no forced confrontation, just time. Time that Carney is using with almost clinical precision, because every day this continues, Canada gets a little more independent. Every new deal, every adjusted supply line, and every alternative partner, it all adds up quietly and gradually until one day the leverage that once looked absolute does not look so absolute anymore. And here is the question nobody in the mainstream seems willing to ask: what happens when the shift reaches the point where it cannot be reversed? Because at that moment, this stops being a negotiation and starts becoming a new reality. Then, 3 weeks ago, something happened that almost nobody saw. But it may end up defining this entire confrontation. Behind closed doors, away from cameras, and away from headlines, Carney's team delivered a message to their American counterparts. No shouting, no threats, and no dramatic language. On the surface, it sounded almost polite, almost routine, but underneath, it was devastating. The message, confirmed by multiple sources, was simple: Canada is prepared to be the most cooperative partner the United States has in the Western Hemisphere, or the most strategically inconvenient. Read that again. That is not a threat. That is not posturing. That is a menu. Carney was not asking for permission. He was not negotiating from fear. He was laying out two paths clearly, calmly, and making one thing absolutely undeniable: Canada is ready to execute either one. And the real message hidden inside that sentence: we have already started building the second option. If you want us to stop, give us a reason to stop. That is leverage, not the loud performative kind you see in press conferences, not the kind built on emotional speeches or political theater. This is the quiet kind, the kind backed by preparation, by alternatives, and by the very real willingness to walk away. Now, here is where the pressure flips, and this is critical. Because while Trump projects strength publicly, his position in the standoff is far more constrained than it looks. Those tariffs, they are not clean. They never were. American industries that rely on Canadian inputs, steel, aluminum, auto parts, and energy, are already feeling the strain. And those costs do not disappear. They get passed down straight to American businesses and straight to American consumers, and there is a limit to how long that can last. Here is the number Washington does not want front and center. Around 2.2 million American jobs are directly tied to the US-Canada trade relationship. Not loosely connected, but directly supported. Jobs in manufacturing hubs, in swing states, and in the exact regions that decide elections. Every week this standoff drags on. That number becomes heavier, more dangerous, and more political. But here is the twist. That pressure is not building on Canada. It is building on Trump, and Carney knows it. Because this was never just about tariffs. That is the surface. That is the language being used. But underneath, this is something much bigger. This is about control. If you look closely at what Washington is really pushing for, it is not just better trade terms. It is structural alignment, a system where Canada becomes permanently locked into American economic preferences. Fewer options, fewer pivots, and less independence over time. In other words, it is a cage. And once you see that, everything Carney is doing suddenly makes perfect sense. He is not negotiating a number. He is refusing to step inside. Now, step back for a moment, because what you are watching here is no longer just a dispute between two countries. This is something much bigger, much more consequential. What happens in the next 90 days could redefine how middle powers survive in a world where economic pressure is used like a weapon. Because make no mistake, everyone is watching. Japan is watching, South Korea is watching, Europe is watching. Every country that depends on American security but fears American economic leverage is studying this in real time, not as spectators, but as future participants. And what they are asking is simple. Is there a third path? Not surrender, not open confrontation, but something quieter, smarter, and more controlled. That is what Carney is trying to prove. Every week that Canada operates without collapsing under pressure, every new trade link, every alternative partner, and every sign of stability, it sends a signal. Not just to Washington, but to the entire world. The signal is this: the system is not as locked as it looks, and that changes everything. Because if Carney pulls this off, if he successfully builds enough alternatives, enough flexibility, and enough real independence, then this will not just be remembered as a trade standoff. It will be studied as a blueprint, a playbook for how to resist pressure without triggering a full-scale conflict. But let us be clear, this is not risk-free. If he miscalculates, if those alternative networks do not solidify fast enough, or if the economic strain hits harder than expected, then the consequences will not just be political. They will echo for a generation. That 43-year number we started with, it stops being a warning and starts becoming reality. Because losing a major trade anchor is not just about money. It is about identity, about confidence, and about whether a nation believes it can stand on its own. And that is the quiet battle being fought right now. Not in boardrooms or negotiating halls, but in the minds of Canadian businesses, investors, and trading partners. Do they believe the pivot is real? Do they commit to the new networks? Or do they wait to see if the old relationship recovers? That uncertainty is the real battlefield. And now look at the clock. Trump's window is shrinking. Political cycles, domestic pressure, and economic signals, all of it is compressing the time frame for a deal that looks like a win. If that window closes, he faces a choice: escalate and risk real damage at home, or step back and absorb the perception of a loss. Neither option is clean, and that is exactly the position Carney has been building toward. A situation where time itself becomes leverage, where every quiet week without collapse weakens the pressure, not dramatically, not in headlines, but structurally and inevitably. This is what a real marathon strategy looks like. No sudden turning point, no explosive breakthrough, just the slow, relentless accumulation of options until the other side realizes they are the ones running out of road. So now the question turns to you. Does Carney's strategy hold? Does this quiet pivot succeed in reshaping the balance of power? Or does Trump find a way to force a decisive moment before the shift is complete? Because one thing is certain: in a world obsessed with speed, headlines, and instant victories, the most dangerous player in the room is the one who never needed to sprint in the first place. He came prepared to run the entire race. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for more daily updates and analysis.